So if I may, I'd like to hand over to Roddy Gow, the chairman of the Asia Scotland Institute, to start proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very glad to host this important discussion on Hong Kong today. And we are uniquely privileged to be able to welcome, as Doug has said, Sir Malcolm Rifkind, former Foreign Secretary of Great Britain during the period of the handover of Hong Kong. We're also delighted to have Dennis Kwok, the founder of the Civic Party and a member of the Legislative Council, and joining us momentarily, Alvin Yeung, leader of the Civic Party and a Legislative Council member. Both of them are in Hong Kong. I met Alvin and Dennis last year in New York at Asia Society, where they were taking part in a panel discussing the popular protests against the proposed Chinese Communist Party legislation. And of course, they bring a very special viewpoint of what is actually happening in Hong Kong now and is likely to happen in the future. Sir Malcolm, as one of the principal architects of the Sino-British handover negotiations, can lead us off by reflecting on how Hong Kong's future was envisaged and the belief, understanding, that China might embrace some aspects of Western liberal democracy rather than move towards a much more authoritarian system. I might add that there's always been a very strong connection between Scotland and Hong Kong, as merchants from these shores travel east, many to found great trading houses such as Jardines and Swires and global banks. So it's particularly appropriate that we at the Asia Scotland Institute have this opportunity today to host this discussion on Hong Kong and its future. And I quote, "At the vanguard of British colonial expansion, Scots and their contributions still reverberate in commerce, politics, trade, and literature." But 4 days ago, there was an announcement last Saturday about the national security law, which Dennis Kwok described as a breach of promise to the Hong Kong people. So welcome to everybody following this webinar and to our panelists. And as I said, if I might, Sir Malcolm, ask you to start off by positioning the current situation in its historical context, given your involvement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roddy. I shall be very happy to try and do so. I was privileged to be Foreign Secretary for the 2 years, the final 2 years, 1995 to 1997. Most of the hard slog had already been done by Geoffrey Howe, Margaret Thatcher, Douglas Hurd, with the Chinese equivalents. And it's worth remembering that the reasons why this happened wasn't a choice on the part of the United Kingdom. A substantial part of Hong Kong was held by the United Kingdom as part of a 99-year lease, which expired in 1997. And it was agreed that Hong Kong couldn't be divided, and therefore some form or fashion, this had to be taken into account. Deng Xiaoping was responsible for the initial concept of two systems in one country, and that was not simply an act of generosity on the part of China. It was for reasons which are still relevant today, that Hong Kong is an incredibly valuable economic asset to China, much more even in 97 than now, but still very, very important. A very large part of the investment that ends up in China, the capital is raised in Hong Kong, and without Hong Kong, China would be by far the poorer. So the offer that was made and the negotiations that took place were based on the fact that Hong Kong would, although technically part of China, continue to have full autonomy. And that was not just in a symbolic sense. What was crucial about this was that it would increasingly have a democratic system of government, if that's what the people of Hong Kong wanted. And most crucial of all, that the rule of law, which had existed for many years in Hong Kong, would continue to prevail. And of course, it's the rule of law that is the crucial question at this moment in time. Because whenever there has been disputes between the people of Hong Kong, between the Hong Kong executive, or in other respects, it is the courts of Hong Kong that have sat on this, including its Supreme Court, and they are genuinely independent of politics. They have been able to act in an independent fashion, and their judgments have been respected both by corporate institutions, but even more important, by the people of Hong Kong. Now, the United Kingdom's involvement did not cease in 1997, despite what the Chinese government would like to believe. Whenever we offer a view or make representations, we are accused of interference. that is complete nonsense. And of course, the Chinese government know it's complete nonsense. We, along with China, the British government, the Chinese government, were the two signatories of a treaty, a 50-year treaty, which still has 23 years to run until 2040. And it was a treaty deposited at the United Nations. And if you are a signatory to a treaty, then you have a responsibility, not just a right, you have an obligation during the period that that treaty continues to ensure that its terms are respected. And therefore, when we make representations or put forward proposals on Hong Kong, it is not interference by a former colonial power. It is, we involve ourselves only to the extent that our treaty obligations require us to do so. And what has been most disturbing is, and I'm not going to speak for more than another minute or so because I know others will wish to comment and have questions and so forth. But what is most disturbing about the events of the recent past is that for the first years of the handover from 97 until Xi Jinping came to power, there were problems. There were attempts by the Chinese Communist government to limit the freedom and autonomy of Hong Kong. But when it became clear that the people of Hong Kong, in a most extraordinary and remarkable and public way, would not accept that, they backed off. What has been different now, of course, is the degree of determination on the part of Xi Jinping to effectively destroy the substance of two systems in one country. And I don't believe, and I think most people would agree with this, that the Chinese want to remove the symbolism of two systems in one country. They want to be able to say they are continuing, as they would argue, to observe the treaty requirements and for Hong Kong to be different to mainland China. But what they are wanting to do by a series of salami tactics, and these tactics are getting much more strident and much more aggressive now, is to remove the substance of autonomy. And the announcement just a couple of days ago on the national security law and what its contents are likely to be was the most sinister and the most damaging and most substantial interference and destruction of two systems in one country that we have so far seen. Not only is this law going to be passed by a rubber-stamped Chinese parliament with no Hong Kong involvement, but any legal disputes about the application of this law, which will include, we are likely to see, proposals on extradition from Hong Kong to mainland China. Any legal issues on that, instead of being treated by Hong Kong's existing courts, Carrie Lam, as chief executive, will be able to appoint the judges who would hear any such disputes. And we all know that, sadly, the chief executive of Hong Kong acts ultimately under Beijing's control. And therefore, this would be to ensure judges who were compliant. So it couldn't be more serious. Very final comment. The United Kingdom is not naive. The people of Hong Kong are not naive. We know China has the power to impose its will to a substantial degree. The objective, I would suggest, has to be to persuade, in the best sense, to persuade Xi Jinping that he and the Chinese government and China as a state will lose far more than they will gain if they destroy the substance of Hong Kong autonomy. They will turn Hong Kong not into an economic asset and an example to the world, but to a hollow shell where the financial institutions will have left, not immediately, not overnight, but over a period of time, and where the best of Hong Kong's people, the most able and active people, will have concluded sadly that they cannot live under shackles of a totalitarian state and will have left Hong Kong. So once China realizes that that's what the current policy will lead to, then let us hope, and it's not certain, but let us hope they will not be so foolish as to persist with the policy they are currently pursuing.
So Malcolm, thank you very much indeed for explaining the background so forcibly and so eloquently. And I'd now like to invite Dennis Kwok to comment on the current situation as he sees it. And I'll also ask Doug Cook to then take over handling of the questions to panelists. Thank you. Dennis?
Thank you very much for hosting this event, and very much for Sir Malcolm in setting out the history and the background. As we are speaking, we are hearing news every day regarding this national security law. Now, the contents of this law are completely unknown to us. We don't know what's exactly going to be in there. The wordings are unknown. There is no transparency whatsoever about this law. And in fact, we are hearing news that this law will be passed by the end of June, and we will not know the contents of this law until after it has been enacted and promulgated by the MPCSC and also the Hong Kong government. And, you know, speaking for myself, I feel that there's no dignity left for Hong Kong people. You know, a law is being discussed and being drafted and will soon be passed 2,000 miles away from Hong Kong by people that I don't know, the contents of which we have no idea. We could only guess. We only have some guidelines and explanatory statement from Xinhua News Agency. And every day we have to find out a bit more and a bit more. And even the former Chief Justice, Andrew Lee, has come out and questioned that, you know, the proposal of having the Chief Executive to appoint judges to hear national security law cases would be an attack on judicial independence, which is, of course, the central pillar of the rule of law in Hong Kong. Judicial independence is very important. But this law appears to attack that very important principle. And we're also hearing that in some exceptional circumstances, we don't know what kind of exceptional circumstances, the Central People's Government could take over completely and enforce the law. And actually, it would appear that they could then have the people who they think have committed the offense to be tried in Chinese courts in accordance with Chinese laws. And of course, this law that will be enacted by the National People's Congress Standing Committee, the power of interpretation rests with the MPCSC. Now, the scary part is this. Although they say the law has no retrospective effect, the interpretation by MPCSC would have retrospective effect. So let's say they pass the law by the end of this month, and to say that endangering national security has these elements, A, B, C. 2 years down the line or sooner, they could issue a interpretation and to say basically that national security is not only A, B, C, it is A, B, C, D, E. So we would have no way of knowing what conduct falls within a criminal offense and what conduct is okay. Because we know that interpretation coming out of MPCSC could be in substance a de facto amendment of the law itself. And even if that the offenses, they say, most of them will be tried under Hong Kong courts in accordance with the Hong Kong legal system, the judges will have to abide by any interpretation issued by the National People's Congress. So judges' hands are in a way tied, because whenever they come down on a judgment that Beijing doesn't like, Beijing will use its interpretation power to correct the mistake made by the Hong Kong court or the Hong Kong judge. So when they say that, these offenses, don't worry about it, will be enforced by mostly by Hong Kong police, it will be tried mostly by Hong Kong judges, and your human rights will be protected. Well, I'm not so sure about that. Those are empty promises, and we in Hong Kong have no faith that they would not use their interpretation powers for a political reason. Now, the reason why I say political reason is, their best defense, as they always say, is that, look, the UK has national security law, the US has national security law. Many countries, including the EU that is now criticizing us, has national security law. So what is your problem? What is your objection to Hong Kong having its own national security law? Now, of course, the problem is, first of all, Hong Kong is supposed to enact its own security law with regards to subversion, secession, in accordance with Article 23 of the Basic Law, which says that Hong Kong shall enact Chinese legislation on its own. They are now obviously walking back on that Article 23 promise altogether. And they will also set up a national security agency to be based in Hong Kong, so as to allow national security agents to actually work in Hong Kong in breach of Article 22, paragraph 1 of the Basic Law, which says that no Central People's Government's department are supposed to interfere with domestic affairs in Hong Kong. So everything comes under national security. We know that they would use this argument to further expand the scope of their interference into Hong Kong. Today, national security may be acts of violence or terrorism, but tomorrow it could include finance, it could include economic sanctions, it could include many other things, including the internet. And would this kind of conversation be illegal going forward? Am I going to be able to talk to our international friends and partners, which is so important to Hong Kong's success as an international city? Would this kind of conversation by an opposition lawmaker with the international community be outlawed in the future? And also, the last point is they've also included further procedures in this law that would allow them to disqualify candidates from the upcoming LegCo election. You may have heard about this, that they disqualified many members, up to six democratically elected LegCo members from the Democratic side on the basis that they have breached the oath or they have not upheld the oath of office. Now, they have included new requirements in this national security law, or will be included, that you have to abide by, you have to swear your allegiance to the Basic Law, to the Hong Kong SAR, and have to abide by the national security law. And there are talks that if you oppose the national security law, you will be disqualified from office. Now, some of us would be maybe running for re-election next month. Then we'll find out how many of us, if those of us who do enter the race, would in fact be disqualified from office. So the last line of defense for the Hong Kong people is really our elections. Although they are not fully democratic, at least in the past they were fair. Now we are looking at mass disqualification of candidates in the upcoming election. So what has the Hong Kong people left with? Because right now we can't even do peaceful protests because they are using COVID-19 as a reason to say that that you cannot go out on the streets. And whenever there is any gathering or assembly, the police will use excessive force to break it up, and they will not permit peaceful assembly and protest. So that is no longer an option for Hong Kong people to voice their concerns. A year ago from now, a year ago, exactly last year in June, we had the 1 million march, the 2 million march, and at least the Hong Kong people could come out and express their views. And we don't even have those options left. And if you take away fair elections by disqualifying massively many candidates, and we really fear this is the end of one country, two systems.
Dennis, thank you. I'd like to bring in Alvin, really, just to, if you could comment on the national security law as well. But you know, just from a Beijing perspective, clearly they would argue that national security issues are beyond the scope of the Hong Kong authorities, perhaps. They're clearly frustrated with Hong Kong's inability to introduce its own security law previously. So I just wonder whether you really see this national security law as unhinging the one country, two systems agreement. And perhaps if you could pick up on Dennis's latter point about the protests. It does seem to be, as a bystander, that it's become much quieter. And does that mean that the protest movement is over, or is it just in abeyance at the moment?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having us again. Thank you, Roddy. Thank you, Sir Malcolm. And again, we are most grateful that friends around the world are paying attention to Hong Kong. And in fact, this national security law is, of course, making a lot of impact on Hong Kong. And I just want to add one extra point from what Dennis has said. that is Beijing, I would say, is intentionally trying to make it as vague as possible when it comes to the legal definitions and parameters of the potential crimes of the law, of the conducts that they wish to make criminal. This is going to give a lot of rooms for Beijing for creative interpretations in the future. So anybody right now, when they think they are doing something completely legal, they could be deemed illegal tomorrow or when they see fit. So this is why we in Hong Kong, when we were trained it, Dennis and I, we are lawyers here, we as common law lawyers, we do not believe in that. We say there has to be certainty, there has to be clear definition of what anybody in Hong Kong should know and predict what sort of conducts they are allowed to do. But this time, and you know what, when there are rumors suggesting that the National People's Congress Standing Committee are going to pass the law by early next week, we still do not get to see the full draft of the bill. And this is how they are treating Hong Kong people, and this is how they see one country, two system is. I mean, this is completely wrong and unreasonable from our point of view. Even if, although I do not agree with myself, that they have the power to legislate this sort of national security legislations. I mean, when it comes to due process, when it comes to transparency, when it comes to rule of law, people, especially those in Hong Kong, should have every right to have at least a glance of the draft. But unfortunately, we still get no clue of what is going on in the law. This is how Beijing is treating Hong Kong, unfortunately. And regarding the protest, yes, things are slowing down because of a number of reasons. There's COVID-19 since early this year, and everybody has been trying to stay away from each other because of the lockdown, because of social gathering restrictions. Right now, Hong Kong, very fortunately, we are not having a huge impact by the COVID. And in fact, the government itself has relaxed some restrictions on social gatherings. From 4 people to 8 people to now 12 people. People can go to restaurants in a group. But strangely enough, they still ban protests. They still, in the name of public health. And of course, we understand the reasons behind. Every year on the 1st of July, that is the day when the handover took place in 1997. Since 2003, Hong Kong people have been taking to the streets with millions of people. Last year was no exception. And now this year, it seems like the police is going to use COVID as an example, as an excuse to ban another year of protest. I would say the political pressure is felt by less politically active people. We are seeing that large corporations, not only Chinese state-owned ones, but also the ones by foreign corporations like the major banks in Hong Kong or major airlines, they also speak loyally to the bill. And so that is, of course, somewhat discouraging in that sense, because people don't feel that they are having a lot of support, not only when the government is trying to ban the protests, but also the fact that the private sectors are not speaking up. But I have to make a point that so much so that a lot of major corporations in Hong Kong, when they're trying to make money, they turn a blind eye to the fact that this national security law is harming human rights. But I still say the International Chamber of Commerce, they spoke up yesterday regarding the potential harm to Hong Kong by the bill. And also Hong Kong people will not easily give up despite the fact that there are lots of restrictions. The mere fact that, say, Dennis and I and our friends, a lot of activists, a lot of politicians, a lot of legislators from the opposition camp, we're still trying to reach out to friends around the world to speak the truth, because we say that is very important. And in fact, we are aware that yesterday, when the EU were having a summit over the internet with the Chinese government, with Premier Li Keqiang, they make a very strong statement regarding the bill as well. And so we start to feel that, I mean, although there are lots of obstacles, although in the near future we might not be able to have peaceful protests as organized as the one that we had last year, but people in Hong Kong still feel that we are not alone. We are grateful that friends around the world are still paying a lot of attention to it. And I would say, no, so much so that this national security bill would become a piece of legislation as early as next week, but it will not discourage people from continuing fighting for democracy and freedom.
Alvin, thank you very much indeed. Just, if I may, before I open up the call to questions from our audience, perhaps a general question, really, for all three panelists. And perhaps, Malcolm, if you would start. But if we could just think about the broader geopolitical arrangements. Clearly, we've seen US and China trade dispute going on, and to some extent, Hong Kong has been brought into this. But I just trying to sort of get your views about the significance of Hong Kong to China's economy and the significance of the US view that they will no longer regard Hong Kong as an area with special status, and so that could affect their special trade relationships. And perhaps if we could extend it even further to just the rest of the international community's attitude towards Hong Kong. If perhaps you could each comment on some of those issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, can I just begin my comments by, it was raised a few moments ago that the Chinese government's position is, why can't we have a national security law? All countries have national security laws. And they know perfectly well that is an absurd comparison. The whole point about a national security law in a democracy is it is not used to suppress political freedom. We know that in China itself, as in any totalitarian state, they use their law in order to criminalize opposition from non-violent, democratic opposition. They use it in that way. And of course, they don't have the rule of law. They do not have independent courts. I remember vividly a conversation I had with the then Chinese foreign minister, Chen Chi-chen, in 1996. And I went to Beijing as foreign secretary through Hong Kong. And people in Hong Kong said to me, when you see Chen Chi-chen, please emphasize that one of the most crucial things for us, and if we're to have two systems in one country, is that we continue to enjoy the rule of law. And I put this to the Chinese minister. And through the interpreter, I've never forgotten his reply. He said, oh, don't worry, Mr. Rifkind. We in China, we too have the rule of law. In China, the people must obey the law. And I tried to point out to him that the whole point about the rule of law was, it wasn't just the people who had to obey the law, it was the government must respect independent judges ruling what that law is and change their policy if they are found to be acting illegally. He not only didn't agree with me, he had the faintest idea what I was talking about. Someone had suggested, I think very wisely, that in countries like China, and the same applies to Russia, you don't have the rule of law, you have rule by law. You use the law to achieve your political objectives and criminalize those who are opposed to you. Now, the particular point you put to me was about the international response. And I think you raise a very important point here. And it actually helps the leverage we may have. We don't have much leverage on China because she's such a powerful government. The question is, what might be possible to influence their behavior? And of course, what the rest of the world has become progressively alarmed about, particularly since Xi Jinping took over, is the aggressive and bullying nature of their policy to Hong Kong, but not just to Hong Kong. And so Taiwan, they're no longer just talking about peaceful reunification, they're implying that they would invade Taiwan if they chose to do so, and who knows what their thoughts might be. But we've seen also with the coronavirus, they didn't just lie to the rest of the world about the virus, they lied to their own people, and that has damaged their reputation throughout the world. The treatment of the Uyghurs in the west of China is a disgrace. 1 million people incarcerated simply because they might turn out to be difficult to the Chinese government. So I think what you're seeing now, and the final point I make, is that not just the West, It includes Britain, it includes the United States, European Union, but also there's a whole realm of Asian countries. They do not publicly like to attack China because they're very sensitive about their relationship. But the reality is that from Japan to South Korea to Taiwan, right through Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Australia, right through to India, there is now a growing joint concern that China, under its current policies, is becoming a threat. It's no longer just a large partner, not just the elephant in the room. It's a positive threat. So, for example, a few months ago, Japan and India, for the first time ever, had joint naval exercises. Now, what did Japan and India, thousands of miles apart, have in common, other than China? They're both border with China. And now we used to talk of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean as two separate regions of the world, just as the Atlantic is separate from the Pacific. Now, if you are a minister, if you're a politician, if you're a think tank expert, an academic, a journalist, increasingly people are talking about the Indo-Pacific, a single geopolitical region. And what has made that the imperative? It is because the Indo-Pacific is the whole realm of the Chinese government's current foreign policy ambitions. They're entitled to have ambitions, but the way they are pursuing them, for example, in the South China Sea, is deliberately rejecting international law, international norms and rules. So that's where Hong Kong does, some would say it's unfortunate. On balance, I would say it probably helps Hong Kong's case that they are not the only victims of this current aggressiveness by the Chinese government. And that makes the possibility of getting coordinated international action easier to achieve.
Thank you. Dennis?
I think if I may just make a point about how they always compare the situation in Hong Kong to those situation in other Western democratic countries. I think Sir Malcolm is right in saying that there's no good comparing Hong Kong's situation to Western democracies because we don't have democracy. And now they're saying, oh, look, we have waited 23 years for you guys to pass your own national security law. You have failed, and that is why we're stepping in. Well, let's not forget that the Hong Kong people has waited for 23 years for universal suffrage as promised to them under the basic law, and that has not been fulfilled. And that is why the Hong Kong people do not trust the Hong Kong government and to a large extent the legislature in Hong Kong. And that is the reason why they couldn't pass the national security legislation after all these years, because they do not have the political support for it. And to say that just because we haven't passed the law for 23 years and now it's time for Beijing to do it is an absurd proposition. And they also notice that whenever you raise the Sino-British Joint Declaration, their official line is that it is no longer a significant document. It is a historical document. It has been fulfilled. It is no longer any binding obligation arising from that. And I think for the UK, this is a serious question, not just of honor, but of international obligation, because someone signed a piece of paper, a contract with you in 1984, and that guy is now tearing it apart and throw it back in your face and say, this is not a contract at all. This is no obligation arising from this piece of paper. Sorry, I'm sorry, you're mistaken. This is effectively what they are saying to you, the UK, and the rest of the world.
Dennis, thank you. Alvin?
I understand time is running a bit short. In fact, I wish to make a point regarding the economic implications of the national security law on Hong Kong. You see, last year, the extradition bill that Hong Kong people and the international community, including the commercial sector, opposed to was the fact that we tried to stop Hong Kong from sending criminal offenders to China for trial because there's no rule of law. And so that triggered millions of Hong Kong people to take to the streets. And now this national security law is effectively trying to make it possible. When the Chinese government said with exceptional cases, they would have jurisdictions over those very so-called exceptional cases without a clear definition. How do they define exceptional? And so my concern, of course, is how would this national security law going to make an impact on Hong Kong? And now, of course, from the business point of view, although the law itself, as released last Saturday, we did not see any express mention on assets freeze or seizure by Chinese government. But of course, we expect that to happen when it is implemented because they still have other legal equipments to help them doing so. And in fact, the draft itself make it very highlight one very clear fact, that is the chief executive, who is of course appointed by Beijing, will have the right to choose judges to hear cases of national security. Our biggest concern is how are we going to ensure impartiality when it comes to these cases, when the prosecutor, of course, part of the Hong Kong government, representing the chief executive, will have the power, in effect, to choose judges to sit on those cases. That must be extremely alarming, not only to local people, but also to business. And also, of course, there is a trend, we worried, that capitals will starting to leave Hong Kong because there's no certainty on Hong Kong's future and the rule of law. Of course, this capital flight from Hong Kong to other advanced economies in Asia, such as Singapore, Tokyo, or even Taipei, or even as far as London or New York, is very impossible for Hong Kong to get away from the recession that is created by COVID-19. And it will make our economy even more difficult, or recovery from the recession even more difficult. So this is another perspective that I wish the audience would pay attention to.
Alvin, thank you. So I'm going to open the questions up. I've got a question from Grant Doherty, really picking up in terms of the business response, I think, leading on to your last point, Alvin.
Yes,
Grant, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Dennis, Alvin, Sir Malcolm, thank you very much for very interesting comments this morning and for joining the webinar. I'm a Hong Konger myself, having been born and brought up there and returned to the UK in the early 2000s, and I'm deeply saddened and concerned about what's going on. I've got two questions, one for Dennis and Alvin and one for Sir Malcolm. The one for Dennis and Alvin: do you think that business leaders in Hong Kong will at some point wake up and have the guts to stand up and oppose the new security laws? And if they do you see that having any impact with the Chinese government? And for Sir Malcolm, the UK has obviously expressed its opposition to what's going on, but what can it really do beyond offering a citizenship track? What can it really do to address the situation, given the relative strengths and weaknesses of the two states?
I'll try to answer the first question, Grant. Will the business community stand up or wake up at some point? No, I don't think so. What happened with the extradition treaty, the extradition bill last year? I've got friends in the LegCo building and in the business community telling me, look, they're extremely worried about the extradition bill, that they have done business in China, they've had some dealings with officials, there are some underhanded dealings, and they're worried that they would use this kind of stuff to get at the business community. But at the end, none of them spoke out, none of them. It was the 2 million people who came out that helped stop the bill. It was the young people who surrounded LegCo on the 12th of June who stopped the extradition bill. But the business community didn't dare to speak up when it really affected their interest. So this time, what you're seeing is the business community are being forced, or they are all coming out in support, in full support of the national security law, even before they've actually seen the contents of the law. HSBC issued a statement. I don't know why a financial institution needs to take a stance on an issue such as this, but HSBC Standard Charter were required, I guess, to issue statements to support the national security law, even though they have no idea what's going to be in there. So do I have hope that the business community will wake up? No, I don't think so.
Well, perhaps let me add my view to what Dennis has said. The business leaders, they don't speak up, Brand, but they demonstrate their disapproval by action. By what I mean by action, that is to pull out their capital and investment and even their employees from Hong Kong. Recently, I heard from my expat friends saying that in the expat community, people start talking about when and how to move away from Hong Kong, because they understand when there's an uncertainty of future in Hong Kong, when they do not know when would they become the next two Michaels, the two Canadian Michaels in Hong Kong. They do share the fear. And this is something that the Hong Kong government is not trying to believe in. They might be aware of the fact that that is going on, but they trying to turn a blind eye to that and convince themselves that things are just absolutely okay. But reality suggests that there are better options than Hong Kong in Asia. And so my concern is when business leaders do not speak up, when they dare not to speak up, as Dennis said, when major corporations like HSBC have to pledge their loyalty to Beijing. I mean, we have no expectations from other business leaders.
Grant, if I could respond to the question you put to me, and I think the question, just to remind you, the rest of the audience, was what is there that the United Kingdom can specifically do to help? And I would answer it in this way, that arising out of our specific ethical and legal responsibilities, both under the treaty that was signed with China, but also the historic responsibility we have, having been responsible for Hong Kong for so long. There's two areas where we can be particularly relevant in this matter. First of all, what we've done to send a message of very strong and unequivocal support to the people of Hong Kong, not just in terms of morale, but in a practical way. The point you mentioned in your question, that we have said that that we would increase the visa-free access for millions of Chinese BNO passport holders from 6 months to 12 months, but we've gone on to say that that could be a pathway to ultimate citizenship. And of course, there are many young Hong Kongers who are not BNO passport holders, but in reality, if Hong Kong's political freedom disappeared, I suspect not just Britain, but many countries around the world would be very, very willing to accept some of these brilliant young Hong Kongers who would want to start a new career elsewhere. So that is also sending a message to China, to the Chinese government. That is saying, be careful. Don't believe that just by imposing your will in Hong Kong, you will have a captive population in Hong Kong who will have no alternative but to submit not just short-term, but long-term to your control. The people of Hong Kong, some of the most able and best people, will find a way and will be helped to find a way to set up home elsewhere. And therefore, what you would inherit in Hong Kong, Beijing, would be a hollow bit of land with no economic or other benefit and wealth to China. So that is an important bit of leverage, you could say, that we do have. The second is that, of course, this goes to international cooperation, international response. Someone has to take the lead in coordinating that response, because otherwise, very many governments or people who are very, very sympathetic, they have so many other things that they are involved with, that Hong Kong is simply one on a list of matters that they would like to give support. So the United Kingdom is in a unique position to do that. Because we're a signatory to the treaty, because we're a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations, because of the English language, because of the Commonwealth, because of the various other things that we are involved in, we can coordinate that international response. Just give a small example. A couple of weeks ago, through Hong Kong Watch, several of us who have been in senior political positions tried to put together not just a British response, but an international response. And within days, we had hundreds of very senior political figures from throughout Europe and other parts of the world, from the United States, from Australia and elsewhere, former foreign ministers, former prime ministers, and so forth, all putting out a joint statement, very heavily reported, which would have really had some impact in Beijing. So that had to be organized. And that's what the UK is doing and will continue to do, both as private citizens, but also the British government can do that. And we've suggested, some of us have suggested, there should be a contact group of Britain, United States, other European and Asian countries willing to help Hong Kong, so that when there is some new announcement by Beijing, instead of having to start from scratch, we can get a response and put what pressure we can on Beijing as soon as is physically possible.
Thank you.
So Malcolm, thank you very much indeed. We've had a series of questions, but many of your responses on the reaction and responses of the international community, I think, have addressed those. And I'm conscious of time. So what I would like to do is perhaps just ask for a final comment from our panelists. Really just, if you could just think about the prognosis of what you think or how things might develop for Hong Kong going forward. And what we might draw from that in terms of China's broader foreign policy in terms of its response to the international community. And perhaps if I could ask Dennis, if you would start off, please.
What's going to happen, I think, in the short to medium term is there will be a lot of fear and oppression in the Hong Kong community. There is already a lot of fear in the hearts of people because of this law and the way they have gone about doing it. It is precisely to make you afraid. You know, to maybe next time I speak to you or in, you know, this sort of setting, I have to be very careful about the words I use, because foreign interference or foreign collusion that would become a criminal offense, foreign collusion that endangers national security. Precisely what that means, how they're going to write it into a legal language, we do not know. But I don't think we could predict with certainty what's going to happen. But I think what's on the cards is, as I said, a massive disqualification of democratic candidates in the upcoming legislative election. I think the international community needs to warn Hong Kong government and Beijing about what would be the consequences if this happens, if the last line of defense of the Hong Kong people, at least a fair election, is no longer possible. Last year, if you remember, on the 24th of November, we had a landslide victory with our local council elections. The Hong Kong people came out in droves to vote in order to express their democratic aspiration, their will. Would that still be possible? I really hope the international community, including the Hong Kong Watch and all these NGOs and also members of parliament or former members, could really speak up and warn against the consequences of that happening.
Thank you. Alvin?
Yep, I basically share what Dennis said, because in the near future, the major battlefield would be, number one, how would this Hong Kong government and Beijing's National Security Bureau to be set up in Hong Kong going to implement the relevant legislations? That is extremely concerning. But also, of course, the election is coming up. A lot of us in the opposition, we will not know whether we'll be able to stand in the next election or not. But again, we will still do whatever we can. Of course, I would also like to invite the audience to share another perspective, that is, what would the ordinary people do? I mean, politicians, we have things to do. We reach out to people, we talk to international friends, but there are lots of people, ordinary people, who treat Hong Kong home, living here. There are more than 7 million Hong Kong people here. They, of course, they fear, they face pressures when their kids go to school. They fear that even the teachers have to go through a set of trainings on internet or national security, as suggested by Education Bureau here in Hong Kong. This is alarming in that sense. So I also wish friends around the world would also understand that ordinary lives in Hong Kong will be highly affected in that sense, because when we try to stay away from politics. Politics will come to you. This is the sort of saying in Hong Kong. Of course, I understand a lot of people here, they are considering an alternative or to try to have a choice. That is whether they would still stay in Hong Kong or they would go elsewhere. Although, of course, I would not encourage my fellow Hong Kong citizens to leave, but I understand why they have concerns. But again, I understand the spirits of Hong Kong people as demonstrated from last year, that when you call this place home, you would do anything you can to protect it from further harms. And so although I do not have a crystal ball and predict what will happen in the next 2 or 3 months, but I would invite all of you to continue paying attention to Hong Kong and express your support whenever possible, so that we know we are not alone fighting this fight. And may I remind you, we share your values. We share the fact that we are all freedom-loving people. Hong Kong people are just trying to fight for democracy, as the UK or the British have been practicing for so long. And so we are fighting a fight not only for us, but also for the values that we share.
Thank you.
Can I just add?
Could I add to that? Because if the question is what can we do mostly over the next 3-month period, hugely important for the rest of the world, which has many other issues that it's dealing with, to constantly be aware of what is happening in Hong Kong. And you know, we live in a visual age. For the public as a whole throughout the world, and for politicians and for government ministers to be constantly aware of the reality of Hong Kong, they must be able on their television screens to see the people of Hong Kong expressing their protest against the removal of their freedom. So what we saw, for example, over the last couple of years, it was quite remarkable. The whole world was moved by hundreds of thousands, almost millions of Hong Kongers, peacefully marching, demonstrating, doing what happens in a free society, and thereby generating an interest in Hong Kong that is crucial if we are to have any impact on Beijing. So I hope the people of Hong Kong, I know it's maybe more difficult at the moment, partly because of the virus, partly because of the increased pressure from Beijing. But if the people of Hong Kong can continue to show peacefully and in a normal democratic way, in the hundreds of thousands, all ages, all backgrounds, what they are doing to fight for their freedom, the whole world will see that every week on their screens. And although the Chinese government wants to suppress them, the last thing they want the whole world to be seeing is hundreds of thousands of peaceful, law-abiding Hong Kongers being attacked by the police, by people on behalf of the Chinese government. And that is something very, very crucial. So that helps those of us who are wanting to coordinate activity internationally to generate the interest. The interest will always be there in the United Kingdom for historic reasons. But getting the same level of interest in France, in Germany, in other countries, both European and Asian countries, that is going to be very important. And that is where the visual impact of television, social media, quite apart from what politicians and ministers are saying, is crucially important in the modern world.
So Malcolm, thank you. Dennis, did you want to quickly mention something before I hand over to Roddy Gary?
Yes, I just I totally agree with Sir Malcolm, and I just want to add that this is not some sort of you know, the reason why we care about Hong Kong is altruistic motive. There is a very important need for the international community to care about Hong Kong. It's because if Hong Kong fails, if Hong Kong becomes one country, one system, the next issue you will be dealing with is Taiwan. And the Taiwan Straits, the Taiwanese Straits, could become the next global geopolitical flashpoint that would pull you in whether you like it or not if something happens there. So that there is a real need out of self-interest, I think, for Western democratic countries to take an interest in Hong Kong. Because if Hong Kong fails, Taiwan is next. And President Tsai Ing-wen knows this. And that is why she is also doing more.
Thank you. Roddy.
Thank you, Doug. And it falls to me to thank all the panelists and those who've either asked questions or would like to have done so for their participation. This is an absolutely critical moment in foreign affairs, as Sir Malcolm and Alvin and Dennis have said. Our dispute is not with the people of China. The issue is with what their government is doing at the moment in exerting pressure on Hong Kong. For those of us in Scotland, where I started, where the links with Hong Kong, the historic links, are long and strong, the resolution of these issues is of critical importance in a number of areas, in education, in trade, in finance. And I'm very glad that as a result of today's discussion, we are, all of us who have been listening, much more enlightened about the reality of the situation than certainly we were when we started. So, Sir Malcolm, Dennis, Alvin, and Doug, you too, thank you very much indeed for making this webinar possible. Thank you.